So in other words, if you're starting a monarchy, it is going to slip into tyranny, at least within a generation or two, almost inevitably, unless you don't just have a monarchy, unless you institute this
mixed.
This mixed form. So you need to have really a constitutional monarchy is what he wants.
Yeah.
Not that he's going to say, so that you...
Well, the monarchy comes to correspond to the executive, the aristocracy to the House of Lords, or, the Senate, whatever you want to call it, and then democracy to the House.
House of Commons, or at least having a forum from which to accuse or something like that. And I really thought this was interesting and applicable to today. To get anything done, you have to have some kind of singular vision. You have to have the president say, I'm just to try to stuff this into America for a second, as I'm sure we'll get to there eventually here tonight. You need some sort of unified vision running things in order to get anything done. Something that we often complain in America about the rich having too much power and corporatism. Well, really, according to Machiavelli, they really should have some definite outlet for their power. Otherwise, they're just going to take over. Like, they have power. They have money. Money is power. They could raise an army and take over the government themselves. We're much better off having corporate lobbyists that in sneaky ways, subvert the legislative process, but they don't have entire control of it. There's still individual instances in which some of them can be defeated and they don't, they're not, at least not banding together necessarily. It's different corporate interests fighting for different things. It gives them an outlet. And then, of course, our country is a republic, despite what people think, that it's not a democracy unless you live in California and they put everything on a referendum. Which is a terrible idea, but in any case, there you need to have the people feel like they're represented too, and have a legitimate means. Oh, we get to vote for the president, we get to vote for our legislative officials. So I mean, really, we're operating on some of the insights that he came up with, whether we realize it or not.
But he does talk, by the way, explicitly about checking the ambitions of the rich and how they can corrupt the state. And so it is checks and balances. But he does think that the aristocracy is necessary because the people are no better. They can lead to complete anarchy, or the state of California.
He does say, so in one of the early chapters of Discourses, he asks sort of are the rich people or the poor people the better guardians of freedom in a republic? And he says, well, what the rich people want to do is to oppress. what the poor people want is just to keep from being oppressed. So really, the commoners are better, even if you could argue that, the aristocracy, they're more educated, or, they probably know what they're doing in terms of statehood more, but still, it'd probably be better to put a little more power in the hands of people who just want you to leave them alone rather than to put it in the power of people that actively want to oppress others.
Especially in the form of guns. We've got the Second Amendment right here,
Well, that's okay. So that's a good transition to his feelings about war and having a military kind of populace. If you have too much peace, your populace will grow effeminate and will be taken over by neighboring countries.
But also, it's important to have one's own militia rather than these professional mercenaries, which is really interesting. And these mercenaries, they would contract to one city-state one day and then to another the next. And he mentions this guy, John Hawkwood, this illiterate English guy who ran something called the White Company, which makes me think of Blackwater, and came in and made a fortune fighting for all the different city-states. And in the end, I think he ended up doing a good job for Florence, and they buried him in the Duomo. But he's explicitly against these mercenaries, and which I found very fascinating, this idea of one's own versus what's other and what's external to the state.
The thing is, Wes, his talk about all that stuff, though, is it all comes down to practical matters. When he's talking about the mercenaries, he's saying that, they're brave during peacetime and cowards during war, and that they'll happily take your money when they don't have to do anything. But as soon as you put them to the test, they run off. The discussion was all about, if you're gonna secure your state, or if you're gonna go and wage war, you need to do it with people who've got something at stake, like somebody who's got something to lose. So he says there's basically three different things. You can use your own people, you can use allies, like people from a neighboring state, or you can use mercenaries. And he kind of goes through and says, here's why mercenaries are the worst. Not only that, once you win, they feel entitled to take anything that you possibly have, or rather, he says mercenaries just quit. If you use neighboring states, like if you use somebody else's army to do it, then they feel entitled to the spoils that you theoretically should win. So the only way to kind of guarantee the loyalty of the troops, guarantee that they'll be tough enough to fight, and guarantee that you'll secure whatever it is that you win is to use your own people.
Sometimes you can use less powerful allies, but yeah, he's thinking of, say, Venice, or no, seeing the Pope, say, inviting in France to help him go against Venice. And by the way, the Pope then later allied against... So France comes in and rides roughshod all over Italy, takes Naples, and then the Pope changes his mind and says, France has become too powerful, so now I'm going to ally with Venice and, some other Italian states and try and drive out France. So the idea is that, if you have a more powerful ally, you're going to win it for them, essentially.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Either you're going to have somebody that's incompetent working with you and they're not going to be able to help effectively, or if they're too competent, then they're going to...
Yeah.
There's no reason they shouldn't take you over.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy, that was as judicious a criticism of the church as I think you'll find. It's a little too temporal, I think is the word he used. Too much sort of worldly power, but not enough. If you're going to do it, do it. The Pope should have just become a warrior pope.
Well, at the beginning of the Republic, and by the way, he actually raised a militia during his time in government in Florence, successfully implemented that and had Florence use its own forces in battles, which was actually successful at first, and then they all ran away. When Florence, I think, finally fell again to the Medicis, they just turned tail and ran. He worked for the Secretary of Art, what we would call the Secretary of State Department. Yeah, they put him in charge of raising a militia, and he did. And Florence went from using mercenaries to using a militia, which worked out well at first, but it didn't work out well in the end. And some historians think that actually the mercenaries could do quite well. They were pretty crafty about preventing casualties, but they were actually pretty skilled.
Since Blackwater can't get as many contracts now because they got such a bad name, the U.S., they actually got a contract with the Taliban. That would be funny if that happened.
I wouldn't put it past them.
Taliban does not have enough money. That's the problem. They would not accept payment in opium. I don't believe.
Yeah.
Blackwater. And put it past them. I want to go back to this point about establishing or a state and then versus maintaining or persevering. Chapter 11 of the Discourses, he says, "The welfare of a republic or a kingdom, therefore, is not in having a prince who governs prudently while he lives, but one who organizes it in a way that, if he should die, it will still maintain itself." There's an implied kind of criticism there of, I guess, monarchies or total absolute monarchies, in that succession does not guarantee. You could have the greatest statesperson and the greatest prince, but there's no guarantee that any offspring that prince has are going to be able to continue that, because it is so reliant upon individual virtue. And he talks in the Discourses, and I think actually, or maybe in the Prince, about Alexander and what happened to Macedonia. But he says, that Alexander actually laid the correct foundations for Macedonia to thrive after he passed, but that unfortunately the rulers of the 4 states or 5 states that it was broken into just couldn't get along and couldn't figure out their own shit. But if they just had, there was nothing wrong with the overall organization of the state that would have caused a problem. But that kind of is getting to his point that rather than create kind of 5 potentates, breaking up his one individual kingdom into 5 sub-kingdoms, if he had created a judiciary and created a republic, that you have a better chance of maintaining the state over time. So I don't know. I'm sure that, Wes, you got some exposure to classical Greek history and politics and philosophies. Mm-hmm. You read Thucydides and Herodotus, and you read about the Peloponnesian Wars and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that the narrative of Western culture is a narrative where Athens is this beacon of truth and justice that brings democracy and reason and all this other shit into the world, and that Sparta, as the kind of opposition to Athens, represents a kind of provincial, militaristic mindset that Sparta is never considered as having flourished or contributed anything great to the world the way Athens did. And these are the 2 great powers of the Greek era, the ancient world. And what I thought was interesting was the section that Mark read earlier from chapter 2, which is really Machiavelli's little state of nature. It's his version of Hobbes, because you have people, they enter into contracts and blah, 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 and then you get these different forms of government. It ends with a comparison of Athens to Sparta. And he actually says that Sparta was the superior state because of its persistence and because the king drafted up basically what he considers to be a perfect set of laws to run the state, and that they stuck to it. and they deviated for a little while, but then somebody came along who kind of reinstated them.
I think it's because he just saw 300.
Spartans, tonight we dine in hell.
Oh,
Well,
gosh.
I don't know about his attitude towards Sparta exactly. He was an Athenian general, and he wrote the Peloponnesian Wars to give a critique of what went on. But yeah, that's an accurate description of what Sparta and Athens represented. Sparta, of course, did some good stuff. Kicked some Persian ass, even despite getting ultimately defeated at Thermopylae.
In reference to what Mark was saying about creating the balance between the three pillars of state, and he says that Solon gave too much power to the populace, and that ultimately was the demise of Athens.
Yeah, that's probably Thucydides' critique, yeah.
No, this is Machiavelli's.
I know, but he's probably just lifting.
Oh, you think he's just lifting it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it fits in well. I don't know. His net point is that Sparta lasted a lot longer than Athens, and that was as a credit to or due to the structure of government that they imposed versus what the Athenians did. Just bringing it back to this point that you can read these two texts in tandem as describing, one, how to take power, and two, how to keep and expand it. And that there's no suggestion that he thinks that the prince is a blueprint for how to govern a state effectively over the long haul.
And also just a discussion of all the different situations that you can be in. There is no guidebook. There are a lot of general principles that you should keep in mind, but there are a lot of historical contingencies, and it matters a lot sort of what the situation is on the ground when you come in. So it's not just a simple list of here's exactly what you have to do. As somebody said earlier, it's be flexible is really the big thing, as Wes was saying, in your strategy.
I think what he's saying, though, is that if you're a prince, you're going to die someday. And what happens after you die? If you have not set up the state to thrive and persist after you die, then you have essentially failed. But there's nothing in The Prince that tells you how to do that.
Right. It's interesting that the chapter that you quoted there, 11, is about of the religions of the Romans. So in saying that you should set up things to make the state exist beyond themselves, he was really talking primarily about, again, that religious control, that if you have customs that will keep people in line, like there's no substitute for that. I mean, when you don't have the customs, you need to put laws in place, but the customs are first and foremost. And in The Prince, he says specifically, if you come in and take power, you want to change as little as possible because people hate change. Like if you come in and you displace their former ruler, but you pretty much run things just like the former ruler did, most people are going to be fine with it.
If you're taking over a place that has an established ruler, yes.
Yes. Whereas anytime you make a change, he says, you're going to make some enemies, anybody that was benefiting under the former rules, and you're not going to gain very warm friends. The people that will be benefiting, in fact, there's another quote I should find here, something to the effect that pretty much if you institute a fairer form of government so that people sort of just get what they earn. Well, the people that are benefiting from that, they'll feel like they're just getting what they earn, right? They're not going to thank you for setting that up, the ruler. They're going to just be proud of themselves for gaining this. So you've made some enemies, and the people that are benefiting don't appreciate you for it. So just don't do that kind of stuff. Just keep, in fact, you don't want, absolute corruption. You want, if at every level people are just abusing whatever system you've set up. So he used the example of, well, you could, allow anybody to run for office, but in a corrupt state, as you could examine the way America is now, it's like, oh no, the only people that can run for office are people that, because the campaign financing laws, that have to sell themselves to corporations. Like that's the kind of, he doesn't like that kind of thing, but he likes a little bit of corruption. He likes the ability of the ruler to give out favors, to make people personally grateful to the ruler. And that's corruption.
Yeah.
Hunger and poverty make men industrious, and laws make them good.
Yes. He has a very negative view of human nature, that unless people are kept in line, they are going to, and it's not just that they will betray, but they're just fractious. I mean, that's a big thing. Again, this is not so much there's no moral condemnation about human nature here. Yes, people want power and they want to benefit themselves. And so you just have to acknowledge that fact and figure out how to act appropriately.